You dip a tiny spoon into white crystals every single morning. You don't think twice about it, but here's the thing nobody tells you. That craving in your mouth right now is older than your species, older than the continent you're standing on. And once you hear where it actually comes from, you will never look at your coffee the same way again. Let's start with something strange. Scientists spent years digging through fossils trying to answer one simple question. When did humans first fall in love with sugar? And the answer they found wasn't clean. It wasn't a date on a calendar. It wasn't a name or a place. It was something far stranger. The craving showed up tens of millions of years before the sugar did. Stay with me here, because this gets wild. Picture a forest that doesn't exist anymore. Northern Egypt, more than 30 million years ago. Back then, it wasn't desert. It was thick, wet woodland, crawling with life. Somewhere up in that canopy, a small creature is making a decision. Not you, not even close to human, but an ancestor of every monkey and every ape alive today, including you. This little creature has two choices in front of it. Hard nuts and seeds, tough, armored, a pain to crack open. Or soft, ripe fruit, easy to eat, loaded with sugar the body can burn almost instantly. Sounds like a small decision, right? It's not. In a world with no grocery stores, no fridges, no guarantee of a meal tomorrow, this choice is life or death. Chase the hard food that takes effort but lasts. Or chase the soft food that's cheap and easy, but only around for a few weeks a year. Whichever way this creature leaned, it left a mark. Not in a journal, not in a memory, in its teeth. Here's something most people never think about. Teeth don't lie. They can't. If an animal keeps biting down on something hard, its teeth chip. If it's soaking its mouth in sugar for years, cavities show up. A skeleton can't tell you what an animal wanted, but it can tell you exactly what that animal was eating, year after year, for its entire life. So a team of researchers went digging, literally, in a place in Egypt called the Fayum Depression, one of the richest fossil sites on Earth for understanding how monkeys and apes got their start. A dental anthropologist named Ian Towle, along with his colleagues, pulled together 421 fossilized teeth, 5 different ancient primate groups, and they were hunting for 2 very specific clues: chips, which mean an animal was cracking down on something tough, and cavities, which in animals today are almost always linked to a diet heavy in soft, sugary fruit. Now, here's the twist you weren't expecting. Only about 5% of those teeth showed any chipping at all. 5%. That's shockingly low compared to primates today that crack nuts and seeds on a regular basis. But the cavities? The cavities told a completely different story. They lined up almost perfectly with what you'd expect from an animal eating ripe, sugary fruit constantly. Towle summed it up in one simple line. The evidence points to a clear preference for soft, sugar-rich food. Let that sink in for a second. That's not some throwaway detail buried in an old bone bed. That's a straight line running from a creature that lived up to 40 million years ago straight to the taste buds sitting in your mouth this very second. Because here's the part that should genuinely blow your mind. Your ability to taste sweetness isn't random. It's controlled by a specific gene called TAS1R2. And it's not just in humans. It runs through nearly every branch of the primate family tree, shaped over millions of years by exactly the kind of pressure those Fayum teeth are describing. Animals that could detect sugar and craved it got fast, reliable fuel. Animals that couldn't simply didn't survive as well. So now flip everything you thought you knew about your ancestors. You probably picture them as lean, tough, meat-eating survivalists, and sugar as this soft modern thing we bolted on later, something weak, something indulgent. But the fossils are telling us the opposite. Soft, sugary fruit might have been the original diet, the default energy-efficient choice, long before anyone ever picked up a spear or lit a fire. That sweet tooth you keep blaming yourself for? It's not a modern weakness. It's one of the oldest instincts your body has ever carried. But don't picture some endless jungle buffet either. It wasn't easy. Fruit seasons are unpredictable. Trees compete for the same branches. Birds, insects, other primates. Everyone's racing for the same narrow window before the fruit rots or falls. Any animal with a stronger pull towards sweetness had a real edge in that competition, as long as it could actually find the fruit fast enough to matter. And that pressure didn't disappear when our own ancestors branched off millions of years later. It just changed shape, because in Africa, early humans found something even more powerful than fruit: honey. And getting it meant walking straight into danger. We don't have a photograph of the very first person who ever robbed a wild beehive, but we have something almost as good: a cave painting in eastern Spain at a site called Cuevas de la Araña. It shows a human figure dangling from what looks like a rope ladder, reaching into a crack in the rock where bees have built their nest. It's widely considered the oldest known image of a person deliberately gathering honey anywhere on the planet. Experts still argue about exactly how old it is, somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years, give or take. But you don't need an exact date to feel what that image is telling you. Someone climbed toward real danger for something sweet. A fall from that height could kill you. And the bees weren't going to just sit there and watch. Sit with that for a second, because it completely changes how you should think about sugar. For almost all of human history, sugar wasn't a habit. It wasn't a snack you grabbed without thinking. It was a calculated risk, something you earned at real physical cost, maybe a handful of times a year if you were lucky and skilled enough to pull it off. That scarcity, that's the missing piece in how we think about sugar today. And it's about to explain something that will genuinely shock you, because at some point on the other side of the world, people stopped hunting for sugar and started growing it on purpose. The best evidence points to the highlands of New Guinea. A wild grass called Saccharum robustum got domesticated into what we now call sugar cane, somewhere around 6 to 8,000 years ago. Most of what we know comes from genetics and language patterns rather than a single dramatic dig, because the wet tropical soil there destroys old plant remains almost completely. But a major genomic study just last year traced the ancestry of hundreds of modern sugarcane varieties, and it confirmed New Guinea as the true birthplace of this crop. Here's what might surprise you, though. This wasn't some sweet revolution. Early growers in New Guinea weren't refining anything. They were feeding it to pigs and chewing it raw, sucking the sweet juice out and spitting the fiber onto the ground, the exact same way some communities there were still doing it well into the 20th century. Sugar, at this point, was still just a plant, unprocessed, chewed by hand. The real turning point, the one that would eventually reshape economies, empires, and human health across the entire planet, hadn't happened yet. That happened later, in India, when someone figured out how to boil cane juice down, cool it, and turn it into solid crystals. Historians still argue about exactly when. Some say as early as the 5th century BCE. Others place it centuries later during the Gupta period, around the 4th century CE. But here's what everyone agrees on. This single innovation changed everything. A liquid that spoiled fast and barely survived travel had just become a solid, storable, tradable good. In Sanskrit, they called this new substance sharkara, meaning grit or gravel. Say that word slowly. Sharkara. That's the literal root of the English word sugar. From India, the knowledge spread. Sailors carried it toward southern China by around 500 BCE. And centuries after that, in the 7th century CE, Chinese envoys traveled all the way to India, specifically to learn sugar refining, because the Tang emperor himself had taken a personal interest in it. From there, it kept moving, into Persia, and eventually into the Mediterranean, where it finally arrived in Europe as something exotic and outrageously expensive. Not a food, a luxury. Closer to a spice or even a medicine than something you'd sprinkle on your cereal. And for a long stretch of history, that's exactly what it stayed. Rare, costly, mostly reserved for the wealthy or the sick. That scarcity had a strange side effect on the human body. And once again, it shows up in the teeth of the dead. Researchers have studied skeletons from the ancient Levant, all the way to Neolithic farming communities in China and Ukraine. And there's a pattern, not perfectly consistent, but real. As populations shifted toward heavy grain farming, rates of cavities tended to climb. Makes sense on the surface. Starchy processed grains break down into sugars right there in your mouth, feeding the exact same bacteria that thrive on sugar itself. But here's the twist. It's not as tidy as you've probably heard. A 2019 reanalysis in the journal Current Anthropology went back and looked closely at the numbers behind this popular story, and they found cavity rates between farming societies and hunter-gatherer societies actually overlapped by more than 70%. Climate turned out to matter too, sometimes just as much as diet. So that popular image you've probably seen online, pristine, cavity-free hunter-gatherers giving way to rotten-toothed farmers, the second agriculture showed up. That's real in a broad sense, but nowhere near as clean or universal as people love to claim. Which brings up an obvious question. If farming alone didn't cause the dramatic collapse in oral health we associate with the modern world, then what did? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. In 2013, a geneticist named Christina Adler led a team examining something you've probably never even heard of: calcified dental plaque that hardens over time into a mineral called calculus and can survive on teeth for thousands of years. They pulled samples from 34 skeletons spanning roughly 7,500 years of European history. And what they were really reading was ancient bacterial DNA, a frozen snapshot of exactly what kind of bacteria were living in these people's mouths, going back thousands of years. At first, the results matched expectations: a shift toward a less healthy, disease-associated bacterial community right when farming began in the early Neolithic. But then something unexpected showed up. Between that early agricultural shift and roughly 400 years ago, the oral microbiome stayed remarkably stable, barely moved, and then, out of nowhere, during the Industrial Revolution, everything changed again. And this time it changed far more sharply than anything that came before it. That's when the cavity-causing bacteria we consider completely normal in modern mouths today became dominant for the very first time in human history. Read that again because it's honestly stunning. The agricultural revolution took 10,000 years to unfold, and it produced a real but fairly modest shift in human oral bacteria. The Industrial Revolution took barely 200 years, and it produced a bigger change than that entire 10,000-year stretch combined. Something happened in that short window that outweighed the accumulated dietary shift of the whole Neolithic era. So what actually happened? Supply happened. Sugar stopped being something you climbed a cliff for. Stopped being something imported at outrageous expense from across an ocean. It became something manufactured on an industrial scale, grown on massive Caribbean plantations using forced and enslaved labor, then shipped to Europe in quantities no earlier century could have ever imagined. The anthropologist Sidney Mintz captured the scale of this shift with one jaw-dropping statistic. British sugar consumption per person went from roughly 4 pounds a year in 1700 to about 18 pounds a year by 1800, a four-fold increase in a single century, driven by an economic system built on human suffering that most of those consumers back home never had to see or think about. And that right there is the real turning point in this entire story. Not the moment some ancient primate first bit into a piece of ripe fruit. Not the moment someone in Bronze Age Spain risked a deadly fall to rob a wild beehive. Not even the invention of crystallized sugar in ancient India. The real rupture is barely 200 years old. It's the moment an ancient, deeply wired craving, one carried across tens of millions of years of primate evolution, suddenly got handed an unlimited, cheap, year-round supply of the exact thing it had always been asking for. Your body was never built for that kind of supply. It was built for scarcity, for a world where sweetness meant a lucky find of ripe fruit or a dangerous climb toward a guarded hive. maybe a handful of times a year if you were lucky. The craving is ancient. The abundance is brand new. And that's the mismatch behind almost everything you feel about sugar today. The cravings that seem to have no bottom. The sense that you can never quite get enough, no matter how much you have. That's not a flaw in your willpower. That's not some modern weakness in your character. That's millions of years of biology colliding head on with 200 years of unlimited supply. Which brings you right back to that little spoon. It's small, ordinary, easy to forget about the second you set it down. And that's exactly the point. It's not asking anything hard of you anymore. It doesn't need you to climb a rope ladder toward angry bees. It doesn't need you to wait months for a fruit tree to ripen. It doesn't need a ship to cross an ocean. It just needs you to reach for it. The same way something buried deep in your biology has been built to do, since long before there were humans around to do the reaching at all. That sweetness dissolving in your cup right now, it's answering a want that predates your entire species by tens of millions of years. The craving is older than language, older than fire, older than the ground you're standing on. The only thing that's actually new is how easy it's become to satisfy it. If this changed the way you'll look at sugar tomorrow morning, that's exactly why this channel exists. Every week, we dig into stories like this one, ancient human behavior, the instincts your body still carries around without you even realizing it, the gap between the world you were built for and the world you're actually living in right now. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells us this story was worth telling. See you in the next one.